Margaret Thompson stood outside the military hospital tent, clutching her nursing certificate with trembling hands. The year was 1943, and the war in North Africa was raging. At 24, she had volunteered to serve as a battlefield nurse, but the reception she received was far from welcoming. "Another woman who'll faint at the sight of blood," muttered Colonel Harrison as he reviewed her paperwork. The other nurses whispered behind her back, calling her clumsy after she accidentally knocked over a medical tray on her first day. The doctors barely acknowledged her presence, treating her like she was invisible. Margaret came from a small farming town in Iowa, where her father had taught her to be tough and resilient. She had worked in the local hospital for 3 years before the war started, but none of that seemed to matter here. Every mistake she made was magnified, every success ignored. When she suggested a different way to organize the medical supplies that could save precious minutes during emergencies, the head nurse dismissed her ideas without consideration. The other medical staff seemed determined to prove she didn't belong. They gave her the worst shifts, the most difficult patients, and the jobs nobody else wanted to do. Margaret cleaned bedpans, changed bandages on infected wounds, and worked through the night while others slept. She never complained, but inside, she felt the weight of their disapproval growing heavier each day. One evening, as she sat alone writing a letter to her mother, Margaret overheard 2 doctors talking about her. "She's more trouble than she's worth," one said, "always getting in the way. We should send her back home before she gets someone killed." The words cut deep, but they also sparked something inside her. She had come here to save lives, not to win popularity contests. The next morning, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. Instead of trying to fit in with people who had already made up their minds about her, she would focus on what she did best, taking care of patients. She began arriving earlier than anyone else, studying medical texts by lamplight, and learning everything she could about battlefield medicine. When the wounded soldiers arrived, Margaret was always ready. She didn't waste time seeking approval from her colleagues. She simply did what needed to be done, patient by patient, day by day. The soldiers began to notice her dedication. They saw how gently she cleaned their wounds, how patiently she listened to their fears, and how she never gave up on even the most hopeless cases. Word began to spread among the troops about the quiet nurse who worked harder than anyone else. They called her Angel Margaret, because she seemed to appear whenever they needed help most. But the medical staff still saw her as a liability, someone who would eventually cause a disaster that would prove they were right about her all along. Margaret didn't know that her biggest test was coming soon, a test that would either destroy her career forever or prove that sometimes the people others call liabilities are actually the ones destined to become legends. As she fell asleep in her small cot that night, she had no idea that tomorrow would bring the kind of emergency that would change not just her life, but the lives of some of the most important military leaders in the entire war. The radio crackled to life at 3:47 a.m., jolting Margaret from her brief sleep. The voice was urgent and filled with static. "Medical unit, we have a convoy under attack 15 miles northeast of your position. Multiple casualties reported. High-ranking officers involved. Need immediate medical support." Margaret sat up quickly, her heart pounding. Around her, the other medical staff were slowly waking up, grumbling about another middle-of-the-night emergency. But something about this call felt different. The radio operator's voice carried a level of panic she hadn't heard before. Colonel Harrison stumbled into the communication tent, still buttoning his uniform. "What's the situation?" he barked. The radio operator repeated the message, adding details that made everyone's blood run cold. The convoy included 3 generals who were traveling to a secret meeting about the next phase of the North African campaign. Their vehicles had been ambushed by enemy forces and several were trapped in the wreckage. "We need a medical team out there immediately," Harrison announced. "Johnson, Peters, Williams, you're going." He listed the names of the hospital's most experienced staff. Margaret wasn't surprised when her name wasn't called. She never was chosen for the important missions. But as the selected team prepared to leave, problems began emerging. Johnson, the head surgeon, was battling a severe case of food poisoning that had him barely able to stand. Peters had injured his back the previous day lifting supplies and could barely walk, let alone perform surgery in a battlefield setting. Williams was scheduled for emergency leave because his wife was having complications with childbirth back home. "Sir, we don't have enough qualified personnel available," reported the head nurse. "Half our staff is either sick, injured, or unavailable." Colonel Harrison's face reddened as he realized the impossible situation they were facing. Every minute of delay could mean the difference between life and death for the trapped officers. That's when Margaret stepped forward from the back of the group. "Colonel, I volunteer to go," she said quietly but firmly. The room fell silent. Several people turned to stare at her with expressions ranging from surprise to disbelief. "Absolutely not," Harrison replied immediately. "This is too important. We can't risk sending someone who—" He stopped himself before finishing the sentence, but everyone knew what he meant. "Someone who might mess everything up. With respect, sir," Margaret continued, "I have more experience with trauma surgery than anyone else available right now. I've worked more night shifts, handled more emergency cases, and I know the medical supplies better than anyone." It was true. While others had been assigned to easier duties, Margaret had been dealing with the worst cases for months. The radio crackled again. "Medical unit, please respond. We're losing people out here. The general's conditions are critical. We need help now." The desperation in the voice was unmistakable. Lives were slipping away while they stood there debating. Colonel Harrison looked around the room at his limited options. He could send an inexperienced team that might not be able to handle the situation, or he could take a chance on the woman everyone considered a liability. The seconds ticked by, each one potentially costing lives. Finally, he made his decision. "Fine, Thompson, you're going. But if anything goes wrong, it's on your head." Margaret nodded solemnly. She had waited months for a chance to prove herself, and now that chance was coming under the worst possible circumstances. As she gathered her medical supplies, she didn't know she was about to walk into a situation that would test every skill she had learned, every bit of courage she possessed, and every ounce of determination that had carried her this far. The jeep bounced violently across the rocky desert terrain as Margaret held tightly to her medical bag. Beside her, Sergeant Miller drove with grim determination, while two other soldiers scanned the horizon for enemy movement. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the sand dunes that could hide snipers or enemy patrols. "There!" Miller shouted, pointing ahead. Black smoke rose from what had once been a convoy of military vehicles. 3 jeeps and a truck lay, twisted and burning along the dirt road. Margaret could see bodies scattered around the wreckage, some moving weakly, others ominously still. As they approached, the devastating scene became clear. The enemy had set up a perfect ambush, using the narrow canyon walls to trap the convoy, with nowhere to escape. Bullet holes riddled the vehicles, and several had been hit by explosive devices that left them barely recognizable as transportation. "Stay low," Miller warned as they jumped from the jeep. Sporadic gunfire still echoed from the canyon walls where enemy forces might be waiting to pick off any rescue attempts. Margaret crouched behind the wreckage, her medical bag clutched to her chest as she surveyed the casualties. The first body she reached was a young lieutenant who couldn't have been older than 20. A piece of shrapnel had pierced his shoulder, but he was conscious and trying to help others despite his own injuries. "The generals," he gasped when he saw Margaret's medical insignia. "They're trapped in the overturned vehicle. General Patterson, General Richards, and General Morrison. They're all hurt bad." Margaret looked toward the largest overturned truck and felt her stomach drop. The vehicle had rolled several times before coming to rest on its side against a boulder. Fuel was leaking from the tank, creating a dangerous situation that could turn deadly if any spark ignited it. Worse, she could hear groaning from inside, which meant at least some of the occupants were still alive. "We need to get them out immediately," she told Miller. "That fuel leak means the whole thing could explode any minute." Miller nodded and called to his men to help extract the trapped officers while Margaret prepared her medical supplies. The first general they pulled from the wreckage was Patterson, a distinguished man in his 50s who had planned some of the most successful military operations in the European theater. His leg was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken in multiple places. Blood flowed from a head wound that had him drifting in and out of consciousness. General Richards came out next, his uniform soaked with blood from what appeared to be internal injuries. He was pale, and his breathing was shallow, signs that Margaret, recognized as potentially fatal if not treated immediately. The youngest of the three generals, Morrison, had suffered severe burns on his arms and chest from the vehicle's explosion. As Margaret knelt beside the injured men, she realized the full weight of what she was facing. These weren't just soldiers. They were some of the most important military leaders in the entire Allied forces. Their decisions could affect the outcome of the entire war. If she failed to save them, it wouldn't just be 3 lives lost. It could change the course of history. Enemy gunfire erupted again from the canyon walls, forcing everyone to take cover behind the wreckage. "We need to move them now," Miller shouted. "We can't stay here much longer." Margaret looked at the 3 generals, all of whom needed immediate surgery that couldn't wait for the trip back to the hospital. In that moment, Margaret made a decision that everyone would later call either incredibly brave or completely insane. "I'm going to operate. Here," she announced. "We can't move them in this condition. They'll die before we reach the hospital." Miller stared at her in disbelief. Performing surgery in an active combat zone, with limited supplies, under enemy fire, was something no military manual had ever covered. But Margaret was already setting up her makeshift operating area behind the largest piece of wreckage, using it as a shield from the continuing gunfire. She had trained for moments like this without even knowing it, all those months of working with limited resources and difficult conditions. Now everything she had learned was about to be tested in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. Margaret's hands moved with steady precision despite the bullets whistling overhead. She had torn open her medical supply kit and arranged everything she would need on a salvaged piece of metal that served as an operating table. The 3 generals lay before her, each requiring immediate attention to survive. General Patterson was losing consciousness from blood loss. His broken leg was the least of his problems. A piece of metal had punctured his abdomen, and Margaret could see internal bleeding that would kill him within the hour if not treated. She made the difficult decision to start with him, knowing that every second counted. "I need light," she called to Miller, who was returning fire at enemy positions. One of his soldiers angled a vehicle headlight toward her makeshift operating area, while another held a reflective piece of metal to direct more illumination. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. Working with instruments sterilized in bottled water and alcohol, Margaret began the most important surgery of her life. Her training had taught her to work under pressure, but nothing had prepared her for operating while explosions echoed through the canyon and shrapnel occasionally pinged off the metal above her head. General Richards was next, and his condition was even more critical. The internal injuries were causing massive blood loss, and his pulse was growing weaker by the minute. Margaret had to make rapid decisions about which procedures would save his life and which were too risky to attempt in their current situation. As she worked, something remarkable happened. The steady confidence she displayed began to affect everyone around her. Miller's soldiers stopped looking nervously at the canyon walls and started focusing on helping her however they could. They held instruments, provided light, and even helped monitor the patient's vital signs using techniques she quickly taught them. General Morrison, despite his severe burns, remained conscious and watched Margaret work with growing amazement. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked through gritted teeth as she cleaned and treated his wounds. "I trained at the best medical schools, and I've never seen field surgery performed like this." Margaret didn't answer immediately, focused on stopping the bleeding in General Richards's chest cavity. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm and matter-of-fact. "I learned by doing the jobs nobody else wanted. Every difficult case, every emergency that came in during the middle of the night, every patient that other people thought was hopeless. That's where I learned." The enemy gunfire began to intensify, and Miller reported that his ammunition was running low. They needed to evacuate soon, but Margaret wasn't finished. General Patterson's surgery required delicate work to repair. The internal damage, and moving him too early could undo everything she had accomplished. "How much more time do you need?" Miller asked urgently. "We've got enemy reinforcements moving in from the north. We probably have 15 minutes before this position becomes impossible to defend." Margaret looked at her patients. Patterson was stable but needed another 10 minutes of surgical work. Richards required constant monitoring to ensure his vital signs didn't crash. Morrison could be moved, but his burns needed ongoing treatment to prevent infection that could kill him later. "I need 15 minutes," she replied, never looking up from her work. "Can you give me that?" Miller nodded grimly and radioed for emergency backup while positioning his remaining soldiers for a defensive stand. As she continued operating, Margaret realized that everything she had experienced over the past months had been preparation for this moment. All the rejection, the criticism, the assignments to the worst duties, they had forced her to develop skills and confidence that the other medical staff had never needed to build. While others had worked in comfortable, well-equipped facilities, with plenty of support, she had learned to improvise, to work alone, to make life or death decisions without anyone else to rely on. The very experiences that had made others see her as a liability had actually been turning her into exactly the kind of medical professional who could handle an impossible situation like this. General Morrison, watching her work despite his own pain, began to understand what he was witnessing. This wasn't just skilled surgery. This was someone who had been forged by adversity into something extraordinary, someone who thrived in conditions that would have broken most people. The sound of approaching vehicles echoed through the canyon, but these weren't the friendly reinforcements Miller had called for. Through the dust and heat haze, enemy trucks could be seen moving toward their position from multiple directions. Margaret had managed to stabilize all three generals, but now they faced a new challenge: getting everyone out alive. "We're surrounded," Miller reported grimly. "They've cut off our escape route back to base. We're going to have to find another way out." Margaret looked at her patients. Moving them too quickly could undo all her surgical work, but staying would mean certain death or capture for all of them. General Morrison, despite his burns, struggled to sit up. "There's an old mining road about 2 miles east of here," he said weakly. "It connects to the main supply route near Hill 47. If we can reach it, we might have a chance." Margaret shook her head. 2 miles across rough desert terrain would be extremely dangerous for patients who had just undergone emergency surgery, but they had no choice. Margaret quickly improvised stretchers using pieces of the wrecked vehicles and torn clothing. She showed the soldiers how to carry the wounded men while keeping their injuries stable. Every movement had to be careful and controlled to prevent the internal repairs she had made from coming apart. The enemy forces were closing in rapidly. Machine gun fire began hitting the rocks around their position, sending chips of stone flying through the air. Miller made a desperate decision. "We'll have to split up. I'll take 2 men and create a diversion to draw them away from you. You take the others and get the generals to that mining road." Margaret found herself in command of the rescue mission, responsible for getting 3 critically injured generals across 2 miles of hostile territory, with only 3 soldiers to help her. As they began their dangerous journey, carrying the makeshift stretchers across the rocky ground, she realized this was far beyond anything she could have imagined when she first volunteered to serve as a battlefield nurse. The desert sun was rising higher, making the temperature almost unbearable. Margaret had to constantly monitor her patients while navigating the treacherous terrain. General Patterson's blood pressure was dropping, and she feared internal bleeding might have started again. General Richards was showing signs of shock, and General Morrison's burns were becoming infected despite her best efforts to keep them clean. They could hear the battle raging behind them as Miller's diversion drew the enemy forces away from their escape route. But Margaret knew they didn't have much time before the enemy realized what was happening and sent patrols to cut off their retreat. Halfway to the mining road, General Patterson stopped breathing. Margaret immediately began emergency resuscitation, while the soldiers continued carrying the other 2 generals. Working in the blazing desert heat, with sweat pouring into her eyes and her hands cramping from the precise movements required, she managed to restart his breathing and stabilize his condition. When they finally reached the old mining road, Margaret's legs were shaking from exhaustion and her medical supplies were nearly gone. But all 3 generals were still alive. They had made what everyone would later call an impossible journey, under impossible conditions. An Allied patrol vehicle appeared in the distance, responding to Miller's radio calls for emergency evacuation. As the vehicle approached, General Morrison grabbed Margaret's arm with surprising strength. "What's your name, nurse?" he asked. "Margaret Thompson, sir," she replied. "I want to remember that name," he said, "because what you did today, nobody's going to believe it unless they saw it themselves." The patrol vehicle reached them just as enemy forces appeared on the horizon, drawn by the sounds of their earlier battle. As they loaded the generals into the vehicle for the race back to the hospital, Margaret realized that everything in her life had changed in the span of a few hours. The same woman who had been dismissed as a liability just hours earlier had successfully performed emergency surgery under enemy fire and led a rescue mission across hostile territory. She had saved the lives of 3 of the most important military leaders in the Allied forces. But she didn't yet know that the real impact of her actions was still to come. Word of what had happened was already spreading through the military communications network. Reports were being written, testimonies were being recorded, and recommendations were being filed. Margaret Thompson was about to discover that sometimes the greatest legends are born in the moments when everything seems lost. 3 days later, Margaret was summoned to Colonel Harrison's office. She expected another reprimand or perhaps questions about her decision to operate under fire without proper authorization. Instead, she found the office filled with high-ranking officers she had never seen before, including a general wearing more stars than she could count. "Nurse Thompson," Colonel Harrison began, his voice completely different from the dismissive tone he had always used before. "I want you to meet General Eisenhower." Margaret's eyes widened. She was standing before the Supreme Allied Commander, the man directing the entire war effort in Europe and North Africa. General Eisenhower stepped forward with a warm smile. "Nurse Thompson, I've been reading some very interesting reports about your recent actions. 3 of my most important field commanders are alive today because of your skill and courage. They've recommended you for the highest honors that can be awarded to medical personnel." Margaret felt dizzy. After months of being treated like she didn't belong, she was being praised by the most powerful military leader in the Allied forces. "Sir, I was just doing my job," she said quietly. General Eisenhower chuckled. "Nurse performing surgery under enemy fire while leading a rescue mission across hostile territory goes considerably beyond just doing your job." The transformation in how people treated Margaret was immediate and dramatic. The same doctors who had ignored her suggestions began asking for her opinions on complex cases. Nurses who had whispered about her behind her back now competed to work alongside her. She was transferred to a new position as head of emergency battlefield medicine, with authority to train other medical personnel in advanced trauma techniques. But the most significant change was in Margaret herself. The months of rejection and criticism had forged her into someone who didn't need approval from others to know her own worth. She approached her new responsibilities with quiet confidence, making decisions based on medical knowledge and patient needs, rather than trying to please colleagues who had never believed in her anyway. General Morrison, who had made a full recovery from his burns, visited the hospital several weeks later. He found Margaret training a group of new nurses in advanced surgical techniques. "I wanted to thank you properly," he said, "but also to tell you something important. The intelligence those 3 generals were carrying to their meeting included plans for the invasion of Italy. If we had died in that ambush, those plans would have fallen into enemy hands and changed the entire course of the war." Margaret learned that her actions had saved more than 3 lives. They had potentially saved thousands of Allied soldiers and shortened the war itself. The intelligence that Generals Patterson, Richards, and Morrison had been carrying was used to plan successful operations that accelerated the Allied advance through Italy and toward Germany. Medals and commendations followed, but Margaret valued something else more highly. Young nurses began writing to her, asking for advice about dealing with discrimination and proving themselves in difficult situations. She realized that her story was inspiring other women who faced similar challenges in military service and other male-dominated fields. Years after the war ended, Margaret established a foundation to provide medical training for women in developing countries. She never forgot the lessons she had learned about how adversity could build strength, and how the people others dismiss as liabilities sometimes become the ones who make the greatest difference when it matters most. The military hospital where she had once been considered a problem child was eventually renamed the Margaret Thompson Medical Center. A bronze plaque near the entrance tells the story of the nurse who was called a liability, but became a legend by saving generals and changing the course of history. Margaret often returned to speak to new classes of medical students. Her message was always the same. Don't let other people's doubts become your limitations. Sometimes the very experiences that make others question your abilities are actually building the skills you'll need for your greatest moments. The world needs people who can perform under pressure, who can solve problems others can't solve, and who refuse to give up when everyone else has written them off. She lived to be 96 years old, long enough to see women routinely serving in combat roles and leading medical teams in war zones around the world. Margaret Thompson had not just saved 3 generals, she had helped open doors for generations of women who followed in her footsteps, proving that sometimes the people others call liabilities are actually the legends waiting for their moment to shine.